Spoilers. No, like full spoilers. Like we're spoiling it all. Hello, friends. Welcome to a new episode of Spoiled. I am your host, Alex Stadnik. Joined with me today is my best friend. Been friends with him for, 38 years? Something like that? Joe Juba.
Or like 7 months, maybe. But yeah.
Either or, right something like that.
Right, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Hope you're doing well. Hope everyone's doing well out there. We are hosting a spoiler cast all about Final Fantasy VII Remake. And you might say to yourself, you're hosting a spoiler cast about a story that concluded 20 years ago. Well, it did, and then Square saw fit to do some different stuff. So we're going to get into all the changes. If you guys have been watching the podcast and all of our other content, you'll know that this is my first time. Joe has played this game probably more times than years I've been alive.
The original, yeah.
Yeah. So, Joe, my first question, what the hell just happened?
That's a fair question, and it's interesting too, because in reviewing this game, I do in my review allude to the fact that I thought this ending was a little disappointing to this story and also going forward, but it's hard in a review. You can't spoil everything for everyone, you know, so you have to leave it really vague. But the bottom line is here, we're going to be spoiling Final Fantasy VII Remake and the original Final Fantasy in this discussion. So if that's a concern for you, viewers, close the window.
Yeah, get out of here. Yeah, I think it's fair to say we're going to be deep diving into other pieces of canon too. So just anything Final Fantasy VII related, I think is fair game in this conversation. So if you're like me and don't know what's coming next, I thank you for your view, and we'll see you in 5 years when the next one comes out. But just so we're clear, everything is on the table because there's a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, and here's the way I want to, before we even dig into what happened, because that is a big question. There's something I want to frame about it too, because I think even when Square talked about doing this remake, when they announced it, there are lots of different camps in terms of what fans want from a remake. There are some people who are like, just give me the original with better graphics. There are some people who want something that's drastically different. And I think in many respects, Square Enix did a good job here of finding a balance between those things, with lots of familiar things and lots of new things for people. Mm-hmm. But what the kinds of stuff that I'm talking about are not the minor changes.
No.
The kinds of things that happened at the end of this, or the kinds of things that disappointed me about this ending, are not the things well, they didn't go under the Sector 4 plate in the original game, but they do in this game. Those are minor changes. I think for me, the kinds of stuff that we're talking about here are much bigger, broader changes to the story and its trajectory going forward.
Definitely. And I, rightfully so, wasn't sure what you meant on when you talked about that on the podcast and then on our stream. And that became very apparent to me when I finished it a mere 2 hours ago. But that sets the table well. And there's a quote that I wanted to pull out that kind of encompasses all this. When Cloud and Sephiroth are on the edge of creation, Sephiroth looks at Cloud and says, "That what lies ahead does not yet exist." Is that, in your mind, is that both Sephiroth and Square Enix looking at the audience and saying, you don't know what's coming and we are changing things, and you guys get prepared that this isn't Final Fantasy VII as you know it? Everything is off the table that you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that one quote, I think, sums it up really well. But there are numerous parts in that ending sequence where the characters say things that allude to that, right? Aerith says something like, if we go forward, we won't just change events, we might change ourselves, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So what happens at the end is essentially Square Enix going off the established map of what this game is going to be. Mm-hmm. And the way they do that is, so the primary vehicle for this is from early on in the story, they introduced this idea of, well, they called them like mysterious specters early on in the game, but later they had the terminology of like whispers or arbiters of fate. And these are the sort of like, you know, Dementor looking things that are always like flying around.
Yeah.
And throughout if you're familiar with the original Final Fantasy VII, that stands out as a very conspicuous, like, new mystery, because it's something that gets introduced fairly early on, starts like is a recurring thing that you see, but has no tie to the original story of it. So for me, as I was playing, I was like, oh wow, I can't wait to see what these things are all about. I'm curious about like this new mystery and excited to see what it is. And ultimately, what we end up learning in the end is that these whispers basically intercede in the events of the story in order to try to get events to unfold in the same way that they did in the original Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah. They talk about them being the harbingers of destiny with a capital D, I think Tifa says, where it's like, they're in control of what is supposed to happen. And it didn't, when I first beat it, it wasn't clear to me, like, were they supposed to die, or like, you know, like, was it supposed to end that way? Was that their destiny, or is that the Avalanche group officially defying them and saying, this is our path now? Which, going over the tape again, I think it is the latter.
Part of what's interesting with those is the fact that if you're someone who's familiar with the story, you can actually, it's kind of interesting to go back and see the exact moments that they do interfere, because they're, because they are at times things that, if this world that you're playing in the remake has gone off course, you sort of see them actively trying to correct that. So like one example is Wedge, the member of Avalanche, is not supposed to survive.
Yeah. Okay.
All of those members of Avalanche, Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, die in the pillar, on the plate collapse.
Oh wow. Okay. Interesting.
So the fact that the fact that Wedge survives that throughout their, like, in my mind at first is like, oh, that's a thing that, like, that is a change to the story that I am okay with. I'm not gonna get mad that this character that died didn't die. But then what's funny is that at least so we don't see his ultimate fate in this game. He's getting pushed by the whispers. It seems like he basically gets pushed out the window of the Shinra building, which is how I'm pretty sure that's how he dies in the original. Is he like falls, not from the Shinra building, but like he falls from the pillar.
Yeah.
So I think you have these moments of, like, in retrospect, seeing how the world tries to correct itself, but it's just this. It just gets to this meta level that at some point it's like they're not telling a story within their universe anymore. They're telling a story about their approach to the development of the Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see that. And it's curious to me, because when we had talked earlier, you had made it pretty clear that the Avalanche members were gone. And, seeing Biggs in his bed at the orphanage, I was like, this feels like this is different now. And I had wondered, I was like, is this what Joe was upset about? But obviously it's not to that level, but it does make me wonder then, like, what kind of involvement they're going to have. And, like, on a thematic level too, I guess, knowing that that's how Wedge does die in the first game. Like, if he's actually dead, I'd be kind of upset about that. Not from, like, a loyalty to the character, but, like, they killed him and then they didn't, and then they killed him but you didn't see it. I guess Game of Thrones has taught me that if you don't see a dead body, they're not actually dead. And then that makes me wonder, like, why was Jesse not a part of that? It just seems kind of messy in the execution in that regard.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things about the way that game ends that feel messy to me.
Yes.
Which is like ultimately, if we want to get to the kernel of my disappointment in this whole thing,
Please.
it's that, and we can dive in spoilery to the, more specific story stuff after this. But I think the core of my disappointment comes down to, for a game that is a remake of a beloved classic, there are certain things that fans are like part of the draw is the anticipation of seeing. I can't wait to see how they do this part, right? As soon as they announce the remake, everyone's like, well, how are they going to do the cloud cross-dressing part?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of like mystery and fun in seeing how these things that get reimagined.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of danger in that. And like I said, I think that Square does such a good job for 95% of the game of striking that balance and saying like, hey, you were worried that we couldn't do this, but we can do it.
Yeah.
We pay tribute to the stuff you love. We make it feel modern. We can do this.
Yeah.
To the point that as you near the end of that game, as I did, I was like, they're pulling this off. They pulled this off, and I cannot wait to see how they do it for the rest of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, it just feels like such a cop-out.
Interesting. Okay.
Because then you get to the end,
mm-hmm.
and they're basically saying, even though we can do this the way that everyone wants it to be done,
mm-hmm.
we're not going to. Yeah. And instead, we're going to throw in a bunch of weird alternate timeline, broken destiny kinds of stuff
mm-hmm.
that essentially just not only throw the story off the rails of where it had been established before,
mm-hmm.
but also just into narrative territory that is traditionally just bad. alternate timelines and stuff like that is like, it's so hard to do well. And this is a team that has demonstrated that they cannot do that well, because Final Fantasy 13-2 and even Lightning Returns to a degree is like all bound up in that concept of like different timelines and stuff. And it has such a deflating effect of lowering the stakes of the story and just making you shrug, because if it's all about alternate timelines and things like that, then what really matters?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost got that comic book quality to it of like, hey, Thanos, Thanos did the Infinity Snap.
Yep.
Well, we're just going to go to a different timeline and get a new Infinity Gauntlet and undo it.
Definitely. And especially with the way they bring back characters too. There was a couple times where I was wondering if I was reading a Marvel comic book. So I'm happy to finally hear that, because I wanted to hear what was a pain point for you. And what's and I guess we can keep getting into spoilers more, but like for me, the first time that this came up, I had kind of an opposite reaction, whereas it's messy as all hell and I didn't understand some of it because I'm not versed in that lore. But once I understood that there are things that are going to be different, I as a first timer kind of got excited, because this is new to me, and now I'm kind of on my toes, where it's like, even if I think I know what's coming, I don't, because they're going to go on their own story, which, to your point, is worrisome in the regards that Final Fantasy VII is a beloved classic because of that story. So it's like, mm-hmm. when you try to one-up yourself, it doesn't always work. But for me, with no nostalgia, I like that they're trying to keep people on their toes who are like me, but I totally understand where you're coming from your perspective.
Yeah, well, and to finally answer a question that I've had to dodge multiple times in the last week or so too, yeah. It's like, why didn't they call it Final Fantasy Remake Part 1?
Mm-hmm.
Is because Final Fantasy Remake Part 2 isn't actually, like, it seems like it's not actually going to be a remake.
Do you think that, okay,
So I think their next game is not called Final Fantasy Remake. I think it's called, Final Fantasy VII Redefined, or
Dream Drop Distance,
it has some other subhead. It is not Remake Part 2.
Interesting.
Because in my mind, that seems to be the ultimate thrust of this ending, is that okay, so to dive into the quick story explanation for that quick. So all of the whispers are trying to make things happen the way they happened in the original storyline. So Cloud and company essentially use their big final conflict in this is essentially breaking free of the confines of that old story. It's them fighting these whispers, fighting the giant, whatever, the harbinger of fate or something like that. And winning, essentially freeing themselves from the constant interference of these ghosts that are trying to make things go in a certain direction.
Yeah.
Right. It's hard. It is really hard to read that as something that makes cogent sense in universe versus seeing it as a much larger commentary of the developers of this game fighting off the fans who want it to be the same as it always was.
Yeah.
And instead them sort of, fighting off the fans and saying, we are just doing our own thing from here on out.
For sure. Here's my question to you though. Because there are moments, and I've talked about it before, where I unfortunately know some of the bigger plot points of 7, and we're about to dive into them. So once again, if you're still here, why? We're going to spoil it. And I thought they were pretty on the nose, letting you know throughout this that Cloud's visions of Aerith's death, kept popping up. And then there was moments that I thought were kind of callbacks to, and I don't remember the attack, but in the original, when Sephiroth brings the moon down on the earth, there are visual callbacks to those moments. So I wonder, is it maybe not the extreme that we talked about where it's they're gonna retcon all of it? Do you think they'll still have those moments, or were those visions of what could have been if the whispers had their way?
I think Red 13 at one point explicitly says they get some vision. And Red 13's vision is of an older version of him running through the woods with some cubs, which is a very iconic final scene. The final takeaway of the original Final Fantasy VII.
Oh, wow.
Is Red 13 and basically his cubs, something I think it's 500 years after the events of the game. He's a very long-lived species.
I was going to say, holy crap.
But it's him running and looking down at Midgar and seeing that it's been overgrown by nature. The idea of sort of the planet winning out or retaking and undoing the sort of, folly of man or whatever.
Yeah.
But then, so you see that he sees that image and says, this is what happens if we fail today. So the takeaway being if we fail, then things happen the way they did before.
Got it. Okay.
So then Cloud's vision of that is the death of Aerith. There are other visions of that, of Sephiroth calling on. It's not the moon. He summons a giant meteor, but
sorry guys. Yeah.
But it's the same thing. It's I think all of these visions are sort of tied up into the idea of that's the way things were. But then the game seems to be sending the message of because we are fighting these whispers, that's not the way they're going to be if we win.
Yeah. It's hard for me to picture them because of what you're talking about with the old fans of this game. It's hard for me to picture that they would veer off course that much, but everything you're saying also makes sense. So that's a wait and see thing. But I mean, they definitely gave both, and that's kind of why I was confused and I thought this was messy, because they gave so many sides to are we gonna do this? Are we gonna do that? You know what I mean? It took a story for me that it wasn't conventional by any means, but there was good plot beats, there was good narrative thrusts, and then they kind of threw that all out the window in the last 5 hours of it.
Yeah. Oh man, not even 5. I mean, it felt to me that it really went off the rails in like the last hour or so, even.
Yeah,
You know,
definitely.
I mean, there are hints of it, but even some of these things don't make sense. So like Barrett gets stabbed by Sephiroth in the president's office.
Yeah,
that doesn't happen in the original. So but the way the game addresses that, again, correcting the timeline, is that these specters just sort of like bring Barrett back to life.
Okay.
Which to me raises the question again in terms of like in-universe storytelling. Like, they brought him back to life after he got stabbed.
Yeah.
Why are they so confident that this world they're trying to, that the path that they're on is the wrong one?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I feel like that is, I mean, I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm just saying I feel from a storytelling perspective that was not adequately conveyed to me.
No. And yeah, you never got that. Oh, well, I mean, maybe Cloud's visions of Aerith's death were supposed to be that hint that this is going to go wrong, but at the end of the day, they win regardless of that. So it's like, it feels like the Barrett thing, like you said, it felt thematically like kind of just for shock value, and then they brought him back. You know what I mean? It didn't have consequences, and it kind of, I get your perspective on that 100%, where a lot of this didn't feel like, yeah, a lot of people died under Sector 7 played, but like it didn't have the consequences and weight, because I think it felt unfocused at the end, and like, okay, we're fighting Shinra, but then Sephiroth comes in, and because I don't know where things actually line up, I needed more. That was the first time in the game where I felt I was doing myself a disservice for not playing the original 7, because it's like, I know Sephiroth is bad and I know he's the big bad, but I need more motivation than that. It just felt like you're expected to know his motivations, and that was good enough, where I was like, you want to save the planet by destroying the planet? Like, I don't get where your motivation comes from.
Yeah, and that's also very confusing, I think, because even as someone who knows what he's trying to do in the original game, I'm not sure that his goal in the remake is the same. I'm not even sure if that's the same Sephiroth.
Wow.
Because, okay, so here's where the alternate timeline thing comes into play here.
Yeah.
You have it on some level where, with all the whispers trying to guide the party, there's the idea that, okay, there is this like predetermined timeline, or like the way things are supposed to go. The party is veering off of that. So that's one sort of parallel possibility.
Yeah.
But you get a much more explicit version of it in some of the final scenes of the game, where you finally see Zack clearly. Zack, who is the black-haired soldier who looks a lot like Cloud, is really tied up in Cloud's backstory. And a lot of the mysterious imagery about Cloud in this game sort of traces back to Zack. There's like flashbacks about Fire and Tifa and her dad, and his connection to Sephiroth, and all of this stuff is like all of that involves Zack also. But like the defining thing about Zack for fans of the original is that he dies.
Yeah.
That is the thing to know about him.
Yeah.
And that's something that they actually did a good job expanding on. That's a story that they told in the PSP game Crisis Core. Which, again, that's a game that assumes you've played Final Fantasy VII. It assumes you know where things are going, but it digs into some of the content there in an interesting way. So this is a time where, for a game that is generally so friendly to people who have not played the original game, this part of it is I just imagine is nonsensical if you
if you had no clue. Yeah.
If you aren't familiar with it. And a lot of parts of the ending are like that.
Yeah. I can't wait. I have about, I think 3 friends playing this who've never played the original. And I'm just waiting for the day they're like, who's the black haired dude?
Yeah. So what ends up happening there, just to come full circle there, is Zach's the big moment of his death is like he and Cloud are escaping from Shinra and coming up on Midgar, and they basically just they kind of walk into a trap. They're just surrounded by Shinra soldiers, and Zach basically saves Cloud by fighting against these soldiers and sacrificing himself. Mm-hmm. But in this, what we're seeing as evidence of another alternate timeline here is that at the end, we see a version of Zach that survives.
Yeah.
You see a version of Zach that does not get killed by this onslaught of Shinra troops and instead survives, and he and Cloud walk towards Midgar, which is a journey Cloud is supposed to make alone.
Yeah.
And I did not catch this myself, but and some eagle-eyed folks online did that. You see a like package or like a little packet fly by that has a picture of the Shinra dog on it. Mm-hmm. You know, a stamp.
Yep.
The guy you're like, except it's a different design for stamp. It's a different kind of dog wearing a different kind of hat.
Interesting. Okay. I wasn't sure because I caught that, but I didn't catch the different design. So that's interesting. That's cool.
So it's playing around with this idea, and then he and Aerith kind of sense each other as they cross paths outside of Midgar. Mm-hmm. So that is what really, in my mind, leans into the idea of like we're doing alternate timeline stuff here. Yeah. Like somehow, I mean, I don't know if there's going to be like timeline merges or whatever. If somehow Zach is gonna be okay or reunite with the version of our party that we have at the end of this game or what, but it's clearly sort of going in a direction of like not just this is different from the old game, but sort of dipping its toes into this idea of like a multiverse of like multiple different realities. So
that's good we talked about that though, because that was like, I knew he didn't die I knew he did die in the original. I knew he was alive when we saw him, but I didn't think about it from that perspective of this could mean totally different branching storylines. So that leads me to wonder, because one of the notes I wrote down was that Aerith knows more than she's letting on. Even at the end, I think she knows more than she's telling everyone. So I wonder how much she knows. You know what I mean? Like, I wonder if she knows that we've slipped into something different and that's why she could feel Zach. You know, like I'm curious, but this is like what you alluded to now that we're talking about this. Like when I first played it, I was like, okay, like this could be cool because it's a clean slate for me, a newbie. But like, you're right. Alternate timeline stuff is hard to do. And, you know, Avengers, like something like Avengers, I think did it fairly well. But then that opens up a whole thing where it's like, how sci-fi are we getting here?
Yeah. It's like, it's one thing. I think a good example of how to do it right, if you look at something like BioShock Infinite, where there's an alternate reality angle on that, but it comes in as more of a flourish. It's not a world you need to live in.
Yeah.
It's an interesting answer to some questions. But going forward, like this is a world we have to live in. This is a world that like the logic of the game needs to support.
Yeah.
All of this stuff. So this also ties into the thing about Sephiroth, because he's still talking about stuff like, you know, we have to like it's all for the planet or whatever. But at this, like his goal in the original, he's not talking about that. Like his thing about in the original about absorbing the life stream and become, you know, and like essentially like taking up the mantle of his mother, and like all of these things they kind of allude to that in flashbacks, but the Sephiroth that you interact with isn't talking about those things.
No.
Like he doesn't mention that. So, and this is something I don't have a definitive answer to as much as just like a shrug, is that like, I don't know if this is the Sephiroth like from this universe or from this timeline that is still trying to do that stuff.
Yeah.
He seems to be sort of working, if not in league with, at least like whatever he's doing is sort of parallel to the stuff that the Whispers are doing. Like his activity seems tied to what they're doing, and they are foreign to this story.
Yeah.
So I wonder if this is an alternate version of Sephiroth that knows that the version of him in the original timeline ultimately fails.
Oh, some really Thanos like level stuff. Wow.
Yeah. So like if he knows he fails, then isn't it in his best interest to try and like knock that off course and affect it another way?
That would be insane, and that's I hope that's something they can pull off, but that is balancing that with fan expectations sounds like a Herculean task to the nth degree, and that sounds like a very interesting way to go forward, because that was my quandary to you, was we've established that Sephiroth doesn't come into focus in the original until the end of Midgar. And my question
and even then he's not totally in focus. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're okay. Well, that was going to be my question, was like he is so heavily focused in the last 2 hours where I was like, is this like, this feels new. This feels like something that probably, just from what I know, this doesn't feel like it was in the original. And I'd be curious on your take if you think that it helped or hindered the rest of the game. Because there was a couple times in the game where I was like, I don't know enough about Sephiroth, his connections, and his background to make this a huge moment for me, because I'm so curious about what I don't know. And I almost wondered if that would be better off, his inclusion would have been better off in whatever the next game in this series would have been, even though I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, I mean, at first, if you would have asked me in the first 20 hours of this game, I said it would have helped.
Yeah.
I think at this point, Sephiroth is such a known quantity in this story and such a iconic part of it that it seems like it would be a mistake to leave him out of it for an entire game, only to sort of obliquely introduce him in the final scenes, you know? So I think I liked it when I had a firm standing on where what I thought it meant and where I thought it was going. But then when you see the ultimate culmination of it, which is just sort of confusing, Destiny's crossroads of different fates and realities and all that stuff, then suddenly it's less interesting to me, because it's not pointing towards something definitive or even resolved, or it's just, again, it's pointing to that big shrug of like, oh, I don't know,
like, where are we going, what are we doing? Yeah Gotcha.
So and then this is going back to an earlier question you had too about sort of seeing, how closely will future installments stick to the original? Are we going to see some big moments or not, etc.? One thing that stood out to me about the ending is that they've already sort of cannibalized some of the biggest moments. I think part of that, in a sort of general sense, is an actual one-on-one fight against Sephiroth. That is not a thing you get
until the end of the first.
It's until the end of the game. You don't actually face him.
Yeah.
And he does this whole black wing thing, which is more of an Advent Children nod than anything else. But it's it feels like they sort of unload too much of Sephiroth at once at the end to make it this sort of the effective mystery that it was at this point in the story before.
Yeah.
But then there are also just specific things like so like when Cloud and Sephiroth are at the edge of creation, and it does this moment where there's sort of weapons drawn, standing side by side, and it flashes to one and flashes to the other. Flash, 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 flash. That is a, to anyone who's played the original, that is an immediately recognizable homage to essentially like the final blow that you deal to Sephiroth.
Wow. Okay, that's crazy.
Like that is the killing moment where where after you fought whatever weird and like angelic versions of him exist, you essentially like travel through to this kind of like ethereal planescape kind of thing. And it's just Cloud and Sephiroth, and the command you're given is your ultimate limit break, and you just like unload that on him.
Yeah.
And the sort of like the essence of him sort of dissolves. But that final moment has that same sort of like camera work.
Yeah.
Leading up to it. So it's like, well, they're not going to do that again.
Well, yeah.
They've stolen that from themselves.
Yeah. They even Sephiroth even says it right after that. He says, not today. Like, this is not the time for this. So, and that's even more on the head than I thought it would. So they really, they really are pushing that this is uncharted waters. This is brave new world. Interesting.
Yeah. I think so. And that's why, I mean, again, just my theory, but I mean, I think that's why it's not called Remake Part 1.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the next one won't be called Remake Part 2. I think that for the purposes of the story they're telling, they could tell a familiar story in this game. But I think the idea is for them to tell a new story in this world. To get to let's take these characters out of Midgar. Let's take these fan favorite characters, like one of the best loved entries in the series.
Yeah.
And let's give them a new adventure. Let's give the fans one game that lets them sort of relive their nostalgia. Yeah. And then beyond that, let's do something else. And as a fan of this series, as a fan of that game, that is a goal. Like I do not take issue with that on a conceptual level. The idea of doing something new with this story, I think is intriguing.
Yeah.
But the fact that the thing that they're giving me is this weird defying destiny, alternate timelines kinds of stuff, like that's where my issue is. Yeah. That's where my problem is. It's not that it's different. It's that what I'm getting instead has me much more apprehensive than excited about where this story is going.
Man. Yeah. Just like me finishing the game, your comments have become completely clear, and I understand why you have stated the things you have. Also, bravo to you, sir, for masterfully sidestepping all of these questions in a very awesome way. You never tipped your hat to anything, and I appreciate it. Also, I don't know how you lasted this long without talking to anyone about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I know some other folks who finished it, so I've exchanged a few comments. But yeah, this is for sure the first just full on conversation we've had.
Yeah.
Though I feel bad because it's not so much a conversation. I'm just more shouting at you about this. But
yeah, no, and I'm happy for your perspective because you have inherently cleared things up for me as someone who had no concept of what had happened in the original. You've also shared some of your apprehension with me, and now I feel that. But at the same time, too, I just not having the nostalgia like we talked about earlier, that makes me excited because the things that I, learned as a kid growing up trying to get into video games and spoiling the story for myself, now there's an air of I don't know if those things are going to happen. And that makes me even more invested in this future. So that while I share some of that because timelines are insane, and whenever you get into alternate universes and time travel, it's so easy to mess that up. But I'm excited for what I don't know even more so now to see if that comes through.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, like I will still play the next game,
Of course.
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
like you're not gonna stop me from that at this point.
Yeah.
But I think there's part of it that I can give this game, the remake, I can give that just a sort of full endorsement. At least up to the final chapter, it's like this game is just good, story wise, combat wise, like well, the larger story maybe less so, but I really like the individual stories, the character stories,
Yeah.
the different chapter stories that they're telling. I think are all very good.
Yes.
But I think, one of we could start getting into territory where there's just a lot more warnings about, like, for instance, Final Fantasy 13 too. Anytime that I talk about how much I like that game, because like it really does have one of my favorite combat systems in the Final Fantasy series. But every time I talk about it, I always have to be like, that the gameplay in that game is fun and the story is terrible.
Wow. Capital T.
Yeah, well, it is because of some of the stuff, because it's so much about this like traveling between timelines that there's just the big like, well, nothing really matters. Characters can do anything. Anything can happen because of alternate reality reasons.
Yeah.
So then nothing's like surprising or important.
Yeah.
Right.
And that sucks. I'm hoping that they've learned that lesson, because people, can learn from their previous mistakes.
You're very optimistic.
Yeah,
That's true. True.
I'm hoping that they learn from those mistakes and don't continue to mix timelines. I hope it's just like, this is the one we're in now, and that's it. And that comes with challenges too. Do they remember their old timeline? Is it going to be a surprise when Zack walks into Aerith? Or are they just going to parallel each other? But hopefully it's just like, all right, we told you what we're doing. Now this is what it is. Even though I can't tell you a story off the top of my head that mixes a timeline just once. So.
But no, I mean, I think that's a good point. That like giving them the benefit of the doubt. The idea of Square Enix just using these characters that I like in a world that I like to tell a new story, I'm on board with that.
Good.
And I hope that they pull it off.
Fingers crossed. Any parting thoughts? I think that's a good one.
No, I mean, I think we've gone through the major. Well, I mean, there are always small details here and there, but I think that's sort of the broad strokes of why people are A, confused by the ending.
Correct. Yeah.
B, surprised by the ending. And then in different camps regarding whether or not that makes them excited or disappointed.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is sort of, I think those are generally the conversations happening around this ending as people are, finishing the game.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm excited to dive in even deeper. Like I said, just finished it 2 hours, so I'm devoting some more brain time to it. But overall, like this, and I had said it before, but this was a game that took me to a level that I didn't expect. While the ending for me was thematically kind of messy and didn't answer a lot of questions, I didn't take away from my overall joy that it brought me. But I'm equal parts excited and apprehensive for what comes next. And
you think you'll go back and play Final Fantasy VII now?
I think I kind of have to, but then also, I don't know. I'm definitely gonna go for the platinum on 7 Remake, but yeah, I kind of want to see what's different, at least in the Midgar section. If we get some confirmation later on about what comes next, then I don't know if I'm gonna stop or not, but
you basically don't want to spoil yourself, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
right?
But also I don't know if I'm going to spoil myself, because who the hell knows what they're going to throw in the next one. I know I asked for this like 20 minutes ago, but any parting thoughts? I did not think, when we originally pitched this, I didn't think it'd be going an hour, but I'm happy it did, because this has been very good.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot going on in this game. It's fun to unpack it, and I am curious to see if there's more, if Square Enix has more to tell before the next game. whether that's in the form of any DLC, whether that's maybe an update that has a secret ending or something.
Yeah.
I'm currently working trying to, you said going for the platinum, like I'm trying.
Yeah.
So, I don't think there's anything in the game right now, but like with Kingdom Hearts, they added an extra ending in a patch a little after release. So who knows? Maybe there'll be more to see in the future before the next one's out.
Yeah,
but
it is Nomura, so we'll see.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I had wondered when playing it, if Biggs, like, would they save that for whatever the second one is, or would we get like a DLC backstory? I guess that would spoil things for them, so probably wait till the second one. But I'm curious to see where some of those new pieces land. So
that's I think definitely one of the tricky things that they're dealing with is the idea that you have characters that people like now, and you have more time to spend with them. So characters like Biggs and Wedge and Jesse and Zach and all of these things. I kind of am curious about whether or not characters can even die anymore. We didn't see Wedge finally meet his fate.
Yeah.
Biggs is fine.
Yeah.
Maybe we didn't see any more of Jesse after that plate collapse, but maybe their fate is altered. So who knows if that iconic thing with Aerith is ever even going to happen? So it's like.
I can't.
Oh, and Zach, whose whole thing is dying, is suddenly but there's this version of him that didn't die. So just a lot of questions to answer going forward, I think.
I don't envy the writer's room after this one at all. It feels like something maybe Nomura walked in the room, was like, had a cigar, and is like, we're going to change everything. And then walked out, and they're like, how? What?
You know what? And again, my complaint about being alternate timeline related stuff notwithstanding.
Yeah.
I think for someone who, for the creators behind this game, I think it makes sense that they've made this game already once.
Yeah.
If they want to keep it interesting to them, to keep the world fresh, to bring in a new audience for it a little bit, I think that you have to change some stuff.
Yeah.
So I think changing stuff is smart.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just see. We'll just see what they change.
Yeah, exactly. So, Joe Juba, best friend of 83 years. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you guys enjoyed our little chat. Let us know what you think in the comments. And I'm excited for the future. I am thrilled with what this did for my fandom of Final Fantasy. I'm going to start up 6 probably in the next week or so. And I am very excited for what the future holds, even though I'm a little apprehensive. So, as always, you can find our content on YouTube, on our social channels, and on the site. Let us know what you thought, and thank you so much for watching. We'll see you guys later.